All right, guys, we are here at topic 7.8, 1920s cultural and political controversies. So let's think about where we've come from and some of the things that we've learned in recent units and recent topics. And so we came from the Civil War. After the Civil War was something called the Gilded Age. And in the Gilded Age, Americans' lives generally decreased. They worked longer hours for less pay. After this, came something called the Progressive Era, kind of led by Teddy Roosevelt. Now, American lives are going to be improving just a little bit. They're going to be working maybe with the protection of a union, and the president, in some points, is going to actually step in and protect union workers instead of protecting the owners of the coal mine or the factory or whatever it is. And so, in the last topic, 7.7, we learned how there were things like the automobile that made transportation easier, household devices powered by electricity, such as the washing machine, things like a refrigerator that made life easier. And so here we are, and we're going to look now at the cultural and political controversies of this time period in the 1920s. So we're going to start here with urban growth. So by 1920, for the first time in American history, a majority of the population is going to live in cities. So this is a demographic shift that's going to be fueled by some pull factors like the promise of economic opportunities in factories and offices. So we learned a lot about industrialization. That's going to create an abundance of factory jobs. That's going to attract internal migrants from rural areas. That's what's going to make the population a higher percent urban, and immigrants from other countries that are going to be seeking better living conditions. Urban centers became hubs of diverse populations, fostering both collaboration and tension among different cultural groups. Women, in particular, found new roles in clerical jobs, breaking away from traditional domestic roles. However, these opportunities often came with lower wages and difficult working conditions, reflecting ongoing gender disparity. So, the growth of cities, as we mentioned, are going to open up new employment opportunities for women. So, some of their traditional roles were in things like teaching and nursing, and the clerical and service sectors at this time are really going to expand. And it's going to provide women roles as secretaries, as typists, and so that by the end of the decade of the 1920s, more than 25% of women were employed outside the home, and the number of married women continued to work was steadily rising. As I mentioned earlier, wage disparities are going to be very persistent. So women are going to earn significantly less than men for performing the same tasks. Also, maybe if a woman is something like a journalist, she's not going to be taken as seriously as a man. Maybe a man would be expected to be something more hard hitting, like an investigative journalist, whereas a woman would be expected to be maybe a fashion, cover fashion or movies or something like that. So this period is going to be marked by the beginning of broader conversations about gender equality in the workforce, though substantial progress is still going to be decades away. So we have internal migrants and immigrants. So we're going to have the Great Migration, and this is the movement of African Americans. It's already been started by this point, but more African Americans are going to be moving out of the South. So between 1915 and 1930, approximately 1.6 million African Americans left the rural South for industrial cities in the North and Midwest. They're going to be seeking better economic conditions and opportunities, and that's going to be the pull factor. The big push factor is escaping systemic racism. You do need to know that racism still existed wherever African Americans went. It just was not as harsh as the South. So cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh became new homes for these migrants. At the same time, Mexican immigrants moved northward, filling labor gaps in agricultural and industry, especially in the American Southwest and Midwest. So, despite their contribution, these groups often faced discrimination and violence. Particularly, as we mentioned, there's groups like the Ku Klux Klan who viewed them as threats to economic stability and cultural homogeneity. So, peak immigration. So, the early 20th century witnessed high levels of immigration, primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe. However, there's still this idea of nativist sentiment that's going to surge after World War I, and that's going to lead to restrictive immigration laws. The Emergency Quota of 1921 and the National Origins Act of 1924 imposed strict quotas, significantly limiting immigrants from these regions while leaving Western Hemisphere migration unrestricted. These laws reflected widespread xenophobia and a desire to maintain America's perceived ethnic and cultural identity. Anti-immigrant groups such as the revived Ku Klux Klan perpetuated discrimination against immigrants, particularly targeting Catholics, Jews, and people of color. So, there were also artistic changes, such as the Harlem Renaissance and Art Deco. You can see some of the pictures there. These are Art Deco buildings. So, the Harlem Renaissance marked a cultural revolution in African American communities, especially in Harlem, New York. Jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington transformed American music with their innovative styles. Armstrong's improvisation and Ellington's orchestral jazz expanded musical boundaries. Literary figures such as Langston Hughes and Claude McKay explored African American identity, resilience, and the fight against discrimination. Hughes' poetry, deeply influenced by jazz rhythms, and McKay's evocative works challenged racial injustices and inspired future generations. So we can see some of that here. So American literature. So there was something called the Lost Generation. The 1920s also witnessed the rise of the Lost Generation writers, and these are going to be disillusioned by these are going to be writers who were disillusioned by the devastation of World War I. So you have authors like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. They critiqued the area's materialism and societal norms. Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms captured the futility of war, while Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, exposed the era's hollow pursuit of wealth. These works reflected a generation grappling with shattered ideals and seeking deeper meaning in a rapidly changing world. Also, there was a clash between modernism and fundamentalism. And you can think that life is just kind of changing too quickly for some more conservative people, and there's no one more conservative at this time than fundamentalist Christians in the United States. So the cultural clash between modern scientific thought and traditional religious values culminated in 1925 in something called the Scopes trial. So there's a teacher in Tennessee, John Scopes, and he was prosecuted for teaching evolution, which violated state law. The trial, featuring Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryant, those are the two lawyers. So Clarence Darrow is going to be the lawyer representing kind of like the scientific community, and William Jennings Bryant, if you remember, he was 3 times a candidate for president. He was very progressive. He's actually going to be representing fundamentalism here. And so this is going to symbolize the national debate over science and religion. So Scopes, he was found guilty. Surprisingly, he was found guilty. The trial highlighted the growing acceptance of scientific theories and underscored the tension between modernism and fundamentalism in American society. So a xenophobia, again. So xenophobia and anti-radical sentiment intensified with something called the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. So these were two Italian immigrants. There's Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. They were convicted of murder amid widespread bias against their anarchistic beliefs in immigrant status. So, despite dubious evidence and appeals, they were executed in 1927, and this sparked global outrage. The trial exemplified the era's fear of radicalism and underscored the intersection of justice, class, and ethnic prejudice. Women in the 1920s actively challenged societal norms. The iconic flapper embodied this rebellion with short hairstyles, higher hemlines on their dresses, and bold behavior, including smoking and drinking in public and driving around in cars. So you can see these are all kinds of images of flappers drinking in public, driving a car, showing off their legs, dancing, hugging a boyfriend, showing off their legs, and big business banishes the flappers. As we said, there was this tension between modern forces and conservative forces in the 1920s. So in conclusion, the 1920s are a transformative period in American history. And here we talked about the cultural innovation and also deep social and political divisions. And so that is the end of topic 7.8.